Today we're going to compare a couple of video cards. The first one is the TNT2. This one is an Asus V3800. So quite a nice card with all the various outputs. And a Voodoo 3000 AGP. Now these tests have been done quite a few times on YouTube before, but what I'm specifically interested in is to know how it performs using an AMD K6-2. The Voodoo 3 was always seen as the best card to run due to its lower driver overhead when you are using a K6-2, and that's what I want to find out today. So I've got a number of benchmarks. We're running a K6-2 500 with 128 meg RAM, a VIA MVP3 motherboard, and no sound for this test. So let's take a look. So for the first benchmark, we're looking at the Quake 3 time demo. I've done this in two resolutions, 640 by 480 and 1024. So in the 640 by 480 resolution, we can see that the Voodoo 3 is about 10% faster than the TNT2. Now, I don't think that the TNT2 or Voodoo 3's memory should be bottlenecking anything at this resolution. So it does seem like the Voodoo 3 is definitely quicker here. Now, we do have to take into account that the TNT2's core does run at only 125 megahertz, and the Voodoo 3 is running at the full 166 megahertz. So it would be interesting to test a TNT2 Ultra versus a Voodoo 3 3500. But for most people running a K6-2 back in the day, it's probably unlikely that they were running those cards, and they would have been more likely to be running a normal TNT2 and a Voodoo 3 2000 or 3000. Then we jump to the 1024 resolution, and we can see here that the Voodoo 3 extends its lead and is now 13% faster. Now for this particular benchmark, I actually feel that it's probably now the memory bandwidth is definitely helping the Voodoo 3 here. I don't think that the TNT2 is being hampered particularly by the drivers or anything like that. I think it is purely that the Voodoo 3 here has a bit more breathing space. Let's jump on to our first direct 3D test with 3D Mark 99. And here we can actually see that the Voodoo 3 is 10% slower than the TNT2. Now, the TNT2 always had very good direct 3D drivers, and so I suspect that's partly to play here. But it is interesting to see that the roles have reversed, and in this benchmark, the TNT2 is 10% faster. Now, it will be interesting to see if that continues, because our next benchmark is 3D Mark 2000. Here, though, the roles reverse again, and the Voodoo 3 is 8.5% faster. Now, this benchmark in 3D Mark 2000 is running at 1024, whereas the default resolution for 3D Mark 99 is 800 by 600. So potentially the memory bandwidth is helping the Voodoo 3 here, but the TNT2 is not that far behind, so pretty closely matched. The next benchmark we have is Unreal Tournament, and this is the closest of the bunch, basically. It is almost exactly identical. I ran these tests a few times and it gave me pretty consistent scores. Now, the quality of the TNT2 running Unreal Tournament was a lot worse. That's partly because it had to run in Direct 3D due to the version of Unreal Tournament I was running, and the Voodoo 3 was running in Glide. So that definitely makes it a bit hard to compare, but the Voodoo 3 did look a lot nicer than the TNT2. And the final benchmark here is Half-Life 1, using a benchmark that I did to really put a lot of load on the CPU. And here we can see the Voodoo again getting 11% improved performance. So I think that the TNT2 has done, I actually think, better than expected. I would have thought that, based on my understanding, that the Voodoo 3 had lower overhead on drivers. I just don't think that's the case. I think it is a bit hard to compare exactly with these benchmarks still. I feel the TNT2's core is running a lot slower, and it does have slightly less memory bandwidth. So it would be great to test them clock for clock. I do think it's pretty clear, though, that the TNT2's core clock for clock is faster than the Voodoo 3 chip. But I think that the memory performance and the higher clock speed that it can run at is definitely in favour of the Voodoo 3. Saying that, though, I did test a Voodoo 3 2000 PCI, and the results are very similar to the Voodoo 3 3000. And that's kind of to be expected. It is only 10% slower on paper, but I wasn't even getting a 10% drop. So really you'd see very similar results. So I think, I think it'd be interesting to test a TNT2 Ultra to see if you get much uplift when using a K6-2. But to be honest, based on these tests, I would have no problems recommending a TNT2 if you couldn't get a Voodoo 3, other than if you wanted some glide-specific support. That's about it. The Voodoo 3, obviously, the AGP runs at it doesn't use all the AGP features, so it can be a bit more compatible. But in this particular SuperSocket 7 motherboard, the TNT2 ran perfectly as well. And I was using version 5 of the Detonator drivers, so quite old drivers, but that I compared that with some of Phil's Computer Labs benchmarks, and that looked like about the best version of the driver to run with the TNT2. So anyway, I hope that clears up some questions, but basically on the K6-2, both cards perform very well, and I don't think there is a significant difference here to say that it is a driver performance benefit using the Voodoo 3. I think there are other areas that actually impact that. So yeah, that's all for today. Thanks, guys.